Good morning. It's my pleasure today to speak to Rob Sawyer, who is the author of this fantastic new book about Everton, Broken Dreams, the story of the 1938-39 title-winning team. Rob, just wondering, could you give us some background about you as an Everton supporter, an Everton fighter, and your general interest in the club?
Yeah, morning, Paul. Fourth generation Evertonian. Goes back to my great-granddad, Bill Sawyer, who was Everton's secretary just after the First World War. Later became a director in the sort of Dixie Dean years. And it's just been passed down the generations. So I've always had a fascination with the history of the club with those links. And got into writing probably about 15 years ago for Toffee Web. And then became involved with the Heritage Society and written a few books.
I must say, I've read them all and I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in the history of Everton. Rob, I mean, this particular team, 1938-39 title-winning side, can you give us some background about what football was like in the 30s and what Everton was like in the 30s? Because you make it clear from the book, this is a decade like no other in the club's history.
Yeah, topsy-turvy. Obviously, if we go back a little bit further, 1928, Dixie Dean scored those 60 goals and we won the league. But 2 years later, the Blues get relegated for the first time in their history. And hope springs eternal. We bounced straight back up. And then a year later, we were champions again in 1932. So, real roller coaster stuff. And then in 1933, we won the FA Cup, famously Dixie Dean wearing the number 9 shirt for the first time in a high-profile match. But then we sort of hit a fallow period. We didn't kick on, which isn't the only time in our history you could say that.
Very much so.
And by sort of the mid to late 30s, we had sort of lower table finishes, and it got to the sort of 37-38 season where it looked at one point that we were going to be relegated. Even though we had an expensively assembled team, it just wasn't gelling. Fortunately, we brought back a couple of players like Jock Thompson, Billy Cook, and they sort of steadied the ship, and we survived the 37-38 season. The other big teams in that period, Arsenal, especially in the early 30s, yeah. Wolves, but Sunderland won the league in the 30s, Man City won the league. So, there wasn't one totally dominant team, but if you had to say who the big rivals were, you'd probably say Arsenal and Wolves. Of course, Arsenal having Herbert Chapman famously as manager. Everton had a different model. They didn't adopt a managerial sort of situation until the late 1940s. So we had the directors, we had a trainer, the long-serving Harry Cooke, and then Theo Kelly, who took over from Tom McIntosh as secretary. And really the secretary ran the club on a day-to-day basis. He was involved with negotiations about transfers. He would make sure the administration was all in place. And he was like the link between the trainer, the players, and the directors. But he wasn't a coach. But he was Theo Kelly, who took over from McIntosh. Often gets a bad press when you read some histories of the club. But he was a hugely talented guy. Actually the son of a journalist who was known as Stud Marks. Yeah. That was his dad, a well-known journalist. And Theo was also very, very great wordsmith. He wrote the programme notes. But that was the structure. As we went into the late 30s, nobody could really have foreseen how the 38-39 season would turn out, though.
Interesting to mention Theo Kelly there, because not many people might realise that until Theo Kelly took charge, Everton and Liverpool had the common matchday programme, and Theo Kelly was the one responsible for our current badge.
That's right. He was a great sort of PR man, really. Very, very great at sort of raising the profile of the club. So it's good when I've been writing the book to just sort of maybe give the other side of Kelly, because people think about the departure of Dixie Dean early in 38, and then later on when Joe Mercer departed, and there's some more negative stuff written about Theo with some justification, but it was good to sort of bring some balance to that.
Yeah. You mentioned there about Theo's journalistic background with his father. I was intrigued in the book about the number of reporters who were known by nom-de-plumes, like Stove, like Ranger, like Pyrus. I mean, was that a common thing in 1937? Reporters weren't known by their names.
Yeah, they all had these sort of pen names, not unique to Merseyside. Like you say, Pilot, Ranger, or all the others, Ernest Edwards. I don't know if it's to give them some anonymity or whether it's so that maybe the papers, if that journalist could leave, they could still have the column in the name of that journalist. So but I recommend anybody to go and read some of those reports on the Blue Correspondent website that Billy Smith does, because the style, the detail, the flair with which they're written is fantastic. And sadly, even though there were some great journalists out there still, print journalism is a shadow of what it was in terms of the depth of coverage of Everton and other teams.
And of course, the 1930s, not everyone had a wireless at home, so your only access to finding out about Everton was to read about it in the press. So the power of the press in the 1930s would have been massive.
Absolutely, and you think there were probably 3, maybe 4 Merseyside papers, and all. You typically have 3 full match reports after a Saturday on Everton. You have the Echo, the sport, the football Echo coming out an hour or so after the final whistle. And then you have the Post, the Evening Express, the Echo. Huge depths of coverage that people would devour, no doubt, on a Monday morning when those papers came out.
And going back, you mentioned the structure of the committee at Everton, and you're saying at the time, Arsenal had Herbert Chapman. I think Wolverhampton once had Major Frank Buckley. So the Everton model was quite unusual at that time, was it?
It was probably not unique, but we were certainly sort of beginning to maybe lag behind these clubs that were more progressive, putting the team management, the whole team management in the hands of one person. Everton very much sort of stuck with this more sort of collegiate committee model until, like I say, by the 1940s, it was long overdue. But the proof's in the pudding, and it's funny, football's come full circle really, because now you don't have so many managers. You have head coaches who report to a director. So in some strange way, history repeats itself.
Really good point, Rob. And looking back at that Everton team, you mentioned the kind of flirtation with relegation 37-38. And it wasn't that unusual in the 30s, I don't think, for teams to come from struggling one season to bounce back with a title challenge the next season. So, in your view, what was the key ingredient that kind of transformed a very ordinary Everton team to suddenly winning the league title the following year?
Yeah, it was an ordinary team in terms of performances, but not an ordinary team in terms of the talent in the squad. We brought in players in the mid-30s like Alex Stevenson, a fantastic little inside forward. We had Torry Gillick, who we brought down from Glasgow Rangers, a mercurial but occasionally brilliant sort of forward who could play across the line. And then we sort of brought in young talent like T.G. Jones from Wrexham, this great sort of young centre-half. And of course, as Dixie Dean entered his sort of last days at Everton, we brought in Tommy Lawton from Burnley. So there was a mix of established, very talented players and these youngsters starting to come through, and it was just a case of getting them to sort of gel as a team and become more than the sum of their parts. How did it click? Certainly bringing back Jock Thompson at the end of the 37-38 season, a very experienced left half, so a midfielder in modern money, who'd won the Cup and the league previously, and Billy Cook, who again a very experienced fullback, who Northern Irish but with a Glasgow accent, and came back in. So there was certainly green shoots at the end of that season, and then straight away the team went up to Scotland and spent several weeks staying there together for the Empire Exhibition Tournament, and a lot of the players, Lawton included, credit that with really gelling the team, bringing them together, just spending time together. And on the pitch they got to the final of that tournament, losing in extra time to Celtic, playing effectively with 10 men because Jimmy Cunliffe got injured. So that was a huge factor. And it meant that when the season kicked off in the late summer of 38, they just hit this winning streak. I think it's something like 5 games on the bounce that they won. And Lawton was on fire. Tommy Lawton, who really had at this point, replaced and emulated Dean, was just on fire, scoring left, right, and centre. So that time spent together in the summer, some great work by Harry Cook, who very much started to do these 5-a-side practice games. It was all about short, sharp passing, one-touch football, which you don't associate so much with football at that age. You think it was, you always talk about people saying, don't give them the ball for a few weeks, and that way they're more hungry. Well, Everton didn't really do that. It was lots of practice, lots of ball work, and just these sort of players, this sort of blend of youth and experience just coming together, and most importantly, momentum. You start the season strongly, you're on a roll, and it goes from there.
You mentioned the Empire Exhibition competition. I'm sure I was unfamiliar with what that was. Can you elaborate a bit more on what that involved? Which teams participated?
It's an invitational tournament with a mix of. It was probably supposed to be some of the top Scottish and English teams.
Yeah.
In fact, Everton weren't the original pick.
Yeah.
But I think somebody else dropped out and they came in. So it was like, it's probably about 5 games they played to get to the final. And as I say, they just strangely, after that such a poor season, they just found their groove.
Now, you mentioned about the team bonding was a vital factor in the team coming together that season. Going through your book, the number of times Everton stayed in Harrogate. So what was it about Harrogate? What unique qualities did staying in Harrogate have in terms of A, preparing the players for matches, but B, in bonding the team together?
Yeah, I think it was twofold really. Everton had a history, and it continued into the 50s, of going to these spa towns. So sometimes Buxton, sometimes Harrogate, very much Harrogate in this season. I think it was just a chance to get the players away, maybe from the pressures of Merseyside, spend time together, and a lot of it was about leisure enjoyment. So they would have a few nights there. They would train at the local football pitch, play some golf, go to the local theatre or cinema, maybe go and watch a football match up at Bradford or Leeds. But it was also just about having that sort of relaxation and fun together, because there were some real characters in this team. I mentioned Alex Stevenson before, this inside forward. Well, he had his partner on the left wing was Wally Boys, an England international, and they were both diminutive little guys, but absolute mirth makers. They were these sort of pranksters. So your room was never safe. You go back to your room in the hotel and your wardrobe was missing. There was stuff in your bed, or your bed wasn't there. So it was just, they obviously had fun and got on. And that power of teamwork, something that I know Howard Kendall in the 80s was very strong on, is that if you get those players bonded, they'll stick up for each other on the pitch as well.
So you kind of mentioned that Everton started the season on a bit of a roll. Could you tell us a bit more about the style of play, the tactics that they used?
Yeah, I mean, Everton get called the School of Science, don't they? And probably in the modern era, we'd probably be expelled from the School of Science, wouldn't we? But back then, they played very much in the true ethos of joined up, attacking football. You look at the team, it wasn't a big team. You had T.G. Jones, big guy at the back. But up front, you had, Tommy Lawton, strapping 6-foot lad, but versatile. He could play on the ground, brilliant in the air. But around him, you had Wally Boys, Alex Stevenson, who I've mentioned, Torry Gillick, who'd moved over to the right wing that season. Again, he was 5'8", and Stan Bentham, who was this sort of industrious workaholic. Effectively, he was like the link man, really, between attack and midfield. So, apart from Lawton, these weren't big guys. So the style of play, it couldn't just be balls in the air. It was on the ground. It was short, sharp passing. It was interchange. So you'd find that Gillick, although he was a right winger, he wasn't an old-fashioned, sort of paint on his boots along the touchline. He would move across, and Lawton would move out to the outside. So they'd just bamboozle your defenders. It was, total football, if you want to call it that. And of course, you had the power and the sort of drive of Joe Mercer at wing half. And sort of the solidity of Jock Thompson, sort of giving them that platform to play on. So it was great joined up stuff. Yes, that blend of solidity, but also flair. And then T.G. Jones, obviously aerial dominance, but also he was just a supremely assured and gifted player. So he would stride forward with the ball. He wasn't lumping it forward. If he did lump it forward, it was accurate. But otherwise he'd dribble forward and just then spread the ball out to the wide guys. So joined up football. Where it went sometimes wrongly is if you look at the record that season, away form, I think we lost maybe 9 times. It's because once we got into the winter, you were playing on these sort of glue pot pitches. Some of them deliberately so. Allegedly, at Molineux, it sometimes said they watered the pitch even after rain. So we were trying to play this good stuff, this wonderful short, sharp football. And the ball was getting stuck in the mud, and then the other teams would just be hoofing it to their big centre forward and sort of scoring and beating us. So on home turf and on decent pitches, we were supreme, but we didn't compromise our standards for rightly or wrongly, and that's why our away form wasn't maybe as good as it could have been.
You mentioned the away form there as well. You had 9 defeats, was quite a lot for teams to win the title, but the home form was phenomenal. I think only one defeats at home all season led by Charlton Athletic.
Yeah, Charlton were the only team to do the double
Yeah.
Everest, funnily enough. And Charlton were a good team.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
finished in
yeah.
the top four,
Yeah.
so fair play to them. But yeah, home form and all great teams. You know,
Yeah.
really, you should build on your home form. Should
Yeah,
be the
yeah,
absolute
yeah.
bedrock,
Yeah.
shouldn't it? And we drew a few, lost the one, but yeah, we scored a shed load of goals at home. And oddly, though, you look at the story of the season and the tendencies vary.
Yeah.
You'd have over 60,000 for a derby. 40,000 to watch us play Derby County. But other games, even when we'd wrapped up the league, had like 20,000. It's curious. You always think of these massive attendances at Goodison, and it's certainly in the 40s and 50s. But it varied, just as it did in the 80s.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Interesting.
I mean, was that due to the backdrop of uncertainty about what was happening in England in the
Maybe in the
1930s?
late end of the season.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And maybe just people would struggle to get away from
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
On a Saturday. Income, maybe incomes were low, but it's just curious. You always think of these days of yore with football. I
Of
always
course,
imagine it's like
Yeah,
60,
yeah.
70,000 in all these stadiums, but I'm sure this wasn't unique to Goodison.
Yeah.
It fluctuated.
And you mentioned one or two of the games during the season had to be rearranged and being postponed, so they were played in the afternoon midweek because floodlights weren't a thing then.
Yeah.
So that might have been a factor on the number of people who get to the game as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure school attendances were down that day.
Yeah, and I'm sure the factory's not going to just
Yeah.
say, "Oh yeah, have the afternoon off."
Yeah.
So yeah, clearly a factor as well.
Yeah. Now, I mean, some of the key players from that team, and in particular, I mean, Tommy Lawton, I think people might not realise how young he was when he was in this imperious vein of form for Everton.
Yeah, I mean, he was still coming out of his teens.
Yeah.
It's remarkable when you think the responsibility that he had coming into a team that was on the wane. What was a pretty great team on the wane. And who have you got to replace? The greatest of them all.
Yeah.
The great Dixie.
Yeah.
So he comes in, has to edge Dixie out of the team.
Yeah.
And even in that 37, 38 season, when we were struggling, he scored 28 league goals. Probably he was 18 at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, by his own admission, he was a big head. He used to say that. But he backed it up on the pitch, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was probably a more mobile player, slightly more mobile than the later stage Dean.
Yeah.
Most of his contemporaries say he wasn't as good in the air as Dixie, but who was?
Yeah.
But I think he was just the all-round centre forward. You can only imagine how much better he'd have got. Really, he had two proper seasons at Everton.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was the wartime years where he was at the club, but then he'd gone by the time league football resumed. So for me, he's an Everton great, but you sort of wistfully think, what could he have been given the time and given a few more seasons of proper football?
Oh, absolutely. And to what extent do you think Dixie Dean helped Lawton's development? Because if you're going to learn it as a young centre forward, then having Dixie Dean there for your first season is a massive help, surely.
I mean, just watching him in training.
Yeah.
I mean, Lawton did say, Dixie said, I know you're here to replace me, but, anything I can do to help your son, I will. So, Lawton idolised Dean. And you can't help but have learned from him just being with him in training at Goodison.
On the New Year's Day, as I signed on the New Year's Eve, on the New Year's Day, Everton reserves were playing Burnley reserves at Goodison Park. So I left Burnley on the 7 o'clock train in the morning and went to Liverpool Lime Street to report to Goodison Park. We got in, as you can imagine, on New Year's morning. The trains were even late then. But when I got there, I walked down to Dale Street to catch a tram to go up to Goodison Park. And I asked the chap, I said, how do you get to Everton Football Ground? Get off at Speller Lane Wacker, he said, and be all right. So the tram came, 4A tram. And I said, could you put me off at Everton Football Ground, please? I said to the conductor. So he said, of course, he said. He said, you're young Lawton, aren't you? So I said, yeah. You'll never be as good as Dixie, he said. So I thought, well, at 17 and 3 months, I thought, oh, that's a lovely reception to come and do it, whoever told you to see. Dixie was always my idol. Whenever I went and played on the bottom, as we used to call it, on the dirt patch at the bottom where I lived, in Bolton. I was always Dixie.
I mean, a few of those names that you mentioned there, T.G. Jones, Tommy Lawton, one that comes to mind for me is Joe Mercer, who at one stage seen his Everton career was over, and then suddenly he's back in the team, and his kind of inspirational midfield performances play a key role in Everton lifting the title that season.
That's right. I mean, Joe had come to the club in about 1930. Took a few years to establish himself. Famously sort of bow-legged. Didn't look like he was going to be a great athlete, but took a while. He was brought back in again in that sort of 37-38 season. Cliff Britton had been the sort of the right half for much of the 30s. One of my dad's favourite players.
Yeah.
Cultured, brilliant passer of the ball. But maybe Everton needed a bit more strength and stamina, so that's when Joe and Jock Thompson took over the wing half role. At that point, Joe was just really energetic, up and down. Those legs just making runs, driving the team forward, and a great character, positive. Somebody always with a smile on his face. So he must have been a great person to have in and around the squad, as well as that sort of never give up attitude on the pitch. And he, like Lawton, earned his England honours, and Wally Boys as well was brought back into the England team. So that was recognition of how they and the Everton team as a whole were playing in that season.
And they were a great side. The Sagar, Cook and Creswell, Britton, White and Thompson, Geldad, Dundee, Johnson, Steen. It was magic. To be there with them was something.
One thing struck me about that season, and not everyone might be aware of this, in the 1930s, England were not involved in FIFA, so we didn't participate in any of the World Cups in the 1930s. There was no European Championship, so the only competition, international-wise or prestige, was the home internationals involving England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, people might not realise that at that time, those internationals took place on the same day as a full fixture. So for many matches, Everton lost some of their best players because we had players from Northern Ireland, Scotland and England. So and Wales as well. How did that affect Everton's performances? Was the squad big enough to cope? Who were the fringe players who came in and made a vital contribution to that team?
The team picked itself. When injuries permitting and internationals permitting, the team picked itself. Week in, week out, it was the same 11 players for nearly all of the season. Tail end of the season, Gordon Watson came in for Jock Thompson, but apart from that, there was only 12 players who made more than 10 appearances that season. That just goes to show how there was a core team. But there were other players ready to come in when internationals fixtures saw the likes of Torry Gillett, Billy Cook, Tommy Lawton go off. You had the likes of Bunny Bell, who would have been a free-scoring striker for Tranmere Rovers and had then come as basically as cover. You had Jimmy Cunliffe, who'd been unfortunate to lose his place that season after getting the injury at the tournament in Scotland. And then there's some nice other little stories. There's a lad called Archie Barber from Weston-super-Mare. He'd been invited up for a trial at Everton, packed his bag, got the train the next day. So got into Liverpool at the station to be met by an Everton member of staff who was stunned to see the lad with his massive suitcase. They basically invited it up for a game. He thought he was coming for the month. Nonetheless, he had that game, he impressed them and they allowed him to stay. So Archie, from being just a lad playing local football down at Weston-super-Mare, within a few weeks he was playing against Wolves at Goodison on the right wing. So, and people like Archie, Bunny Bell, Jimmy Cunliffe, they all played their part. When called upon, they didn't let anybody down. But when the other players were back or when they were fit, as I say, it was always the same team, week in, week out.
And we can't proceed really without mentioning Ted Sagar, an absolute Everton legend, probably still the standard by which Everton goalkeepers are judged by. Can you tell us a bit more about Ted and why he's such a pivotal figure in the goalkeeping history of Everton?
Yeah, one of the great names of Everton. And my dad, who was born in 1925, if I asked him, who was the greatest Everton keeper, he wouldn't say whether it was South or Sagar. For him, they were on a par.
Yeah,
I know in our lifetime it was fairly big Nev. Yeah, but Sagar is a legend of the club. He'd come there at the late 20s. Been working at a colliery near Doncaster at Thorn. Established himself in the early 30s. A very acrobatic goalkeeper. Not a huge guy, but brave, athletic, liked to command his box, shall we say, and he became known as the boss. And basically, you didn't mess with Ted if you were a defender. That was his area, and you did what he told you to do. And most of the players respected that. There was one exception, and that was T.G. Jones. Tommy, as I said before, was sort of had a lot of belief in his own ability, rightly so. One thing he would occasionally do when a corner came over for the Toffees to defend, Tommy T.G. would just nod the ball back to Ted, and more often than not, Ted would catch it. There's a reportedly the odd occasion where the ball flew into the net for an own goal, and you can imagine the air turning blue with Ted's word. But yeah, Ted was, we had that spine. You had Ted, and Ted had won England honours. Great keeper. Ted, and then T.G. Jones in front of him, and then sort of Tommy Lawton. What a great spine to the team.
You mentioned Ted Sagar winning England honours. He only won 3 caps for England, which is astounding.
Yeah, but you look at Dean. What did Dean win? 16 caps. It was just you get picked, and then this sort of panel of selectors say, "Oh no, let's try him next." And it was very hard to really rack up the caps, and there weren't that many games as well as you were saying before.
So it wasn't just a 1930s example of an anti-Everton bias on the selectors. This continues to this day
through the decades.
Going through the season and fixture by fixture, and Wolves were one of Everton's main rivals that season. So how catastrophic could that 7-0 defeat of Wolverhampton Wanderers have been in terms of the title run, and how well did the team do to bounce back from what could have been a season-ending defeat?
Yeah, at that point, Wolves and Derby were sort of very much the two rivals in the race for the title. You talked about Ted Sagar. Ted missed that game very wisely. Harry Morton, a former Villa keeper, came in and played well, in spite of the 7-0 defeat. Again, famously boggy pitch. Wolves knew how to play to the absolute max on that kind of pitch. It just blew us away. It says something about the strength of character, the belief, and maybe those morale-boosting trips to Harrogate that the team was able to just sort of steady the ship and plough on. But it was such a out-of-character defeat that season. And we did also lose in the Cup to Wolves, much more narrowly, I should say. So they were our bogey team, but we beat them in the league early in the season, and come the end, those points count on the running. And
in terms of, you mentioned Everton's style of football was very dependent on a decent playing service, of which, as the season progressed, there weren't that many, particularly on away grounds. But once we get to Easter, it's the key run in time. We have 3 games in 4 days. And Everton's away form starts to improve again slightly. Is that linked to the improvements in quality of pitches? Do you think?
Probably the pitches are drying out. They're probably sanded by this time. They're probably like playing on a beach. But it came to that Easter, as it often does, doesn't it? Traditionally they always say, you don't know who's going to win the title till Easter. That sorts out the men from the boys. So I think Good Friday we went up to Roker Park. Beat Sunderland. I think Lawton back in the goals. Straight on the train down to London, playing Chelsea. Again, beat them. Back home, a day's rest. Players get massages, bit of treatment. And talking massages, I might just mention another important character in the team. This was another guy called Harry Cook. Confusingly, his real name was Richard Cook, and he'd been a soldier in the First World War and been blinded at Gallipoli. And of course, there was a charity called St Dunstan's that sort of retrained servicemen who had lost their sight, and many of them were trained as masseurs, what they called blind masseurs back then, basically what you now call a physio, because they could use their sort of hands to effectively get knowledge of the body and just help people. And he qualified, moved up to Merseyside, and was taken on by the Blues in the 1920s. So he played a key role in, as I say, it was a very small core squad really. And getting them fit between games, that you imagine the kicks that the likes of Lawler would get to their legs, calves, etc. And so Harry Cook was a key person keeping those guys fit and ready for the next game. So, as I say, they played on the Saturday, back to Goodison for that treatment on the Sunday, and then on Easter Monday, a return fixture against Sunderland. I think we blew them away 6-2. And basically, those 3 victories on the bounce effectively made us red-hot favourites for the title, barring a real fall at the last hurdle of the Grand National kind of scenario at Devon Lock. We were pretty much home and dry at that point.
So how, when and where was the title actually sealed?
Well, bit of an anticlimax. We had another home game a few days later, and we were fully expected to wrap up the title. Cliff Brinton came back for this game, his only appearance of the season, but it was a 0-0 draw, so we another point towards the title, but not quite at the finishing line.
Against Preston, wasn't it?
So slightly disappointing 0-0. So we then went down to Charlton, and as I said before, they completed the double over us. 2-1 defeat. We went 2 down. We got a goal back, and we threw the kitchen sink at them, but they just held out down at the Valley. But the guys came off dejected. But the word came down that Wolves, I think, might have been against Bolton, that they'd failed to get the points there, and that meant that we couldn't be caught. So we actually won the title by losing. But then we went back to Goodison a few days later and beat Aston Villa just to sort of put the icing on the cake. And then the last game of the season was away, and we sort of, I think by then it didn't really matter. We lost that game. But as I say, when we played Villa that last game, again, the attendance was only in the 20s.
Yeah, I saw that.
Now you're in the 80s, so you'd have had a full house. It's hard. But,
and you can't help but think maybe the impending start of World War II in the background.
Yeah.
Maybe people were prioritising other things rather than
other thoughts, because by then people were training up as air raid wardens, all sorts.
Yeah.
And it's funny, this obviously the goings on in Europe at this time, because Everton had developed strong links with Germany.
Of course,
We've been there in 32 and 36 summer tours. We've been one of the first teams to play in the Olympic Stadium. We developed close ties with this guy called Otto Nerz, who was the sort of head of the German Football Federation, and we were planning to go there in the summer of 39. But obviously by this point in the season it was clear that wasn't going to be possible. And alternative arrangements were made.
It's funny how you mentioned about the title, being won by Wolves losing and Everton. Those lost to Charlton the same day. And I love in the booth that you mentioned that loads of Everton fans had gone to Lime Street that evening, fully expecting the teams to come back from London with the trophy, and they were unaware of the fact that Everton had to stay in London for the weekend because they had a game against an Army 11 at Aldershot on the Monday.
Yeah, this is it. We, in spite of this sort of hectic sort of running, we still had other fixtures that we honoured. So we played this Army team, and we didn't just sort of send out the reserves. It was our first team, so down at Aldershot, a day or two later. So the hardcore back on Merseyside had to wait a couple of days to actually welcome the lads home.
So the team lift their 5th title. Fans are obviously very delighted, looking forward to the next season. Obviously in the background you got the impending possible start of World War II. So Everton start the following season, the 39-40 season. Could you just tell us a little bit about how that season progressed and why it came to a halt?
Yeah, we were probably favourites to retain the title because this was a young side. I think Tommy Lawton pointed out the average age was probably about 23 and 24. Only Jock Thompson really was a real veteran. Billy Cook, Ted Sagar turning 30. So this team had plenty of life left in it and was only going to get better. Your Lawtons, your Jones, your Gillicks, Stevensons, they were only going to get better. Actually, the season started off with Lawton scoring in all 3 games at the start of the season. We actually drew a couple, I think 1-1. So it's a sort of middling start to the season. But I think we played Blackburn in one game, and there's reference to how the crowd was down because people knew what was coming.
Of course.
There was these ultimatums going around about if Germany moved into Poland, war would be declared by France and Britain. So it was looking increasingly likely, and of course, sadly, after, just after that third match was played, that transpired. The German tanks did roll in, the Blitzkrieg got underway, and very quickly it was clear that football was going to have to be suspended.
So in terms of, from the Everton perspective, you have a team that's just won the league title. It's a team with lots of promising youngsters. The team has huge potential, and then suddenly the possibility of continuing to establish some sort of dominance dynasty in English football is out of their hands and taken away from them. So how long was that team out of action for, and what did the players generally do during World War II? Because I think you mentioned it in your book there that a few people would criticise, like Tommy Lawton, saying, why aren't you out on the front? Why aren't you fighting in Europe? What are you doing here?
Yeah, well, there was no proper football for seven seasons. Didn't really resume till 1946. Depending what trade you had would decide whether you joined up with the forces or did something else. Quite a few of the Everton players had some kind of engineering trade that they'd learnt as young apprentices, and they tended to do civilian work. A lot of them worked in shipyards on Merseyside. Stan Bentham worked at the Burton Wood Aerodrome, doing work on aircraft there. But probably most of the lads joined the forces, and they became almost always physical training instructors, or PTIs. Basically, the lads who got the other guys fit. Why was that? I think it was partly because probably the powers that be didn't want to send these great high-profile stars of the day to the front line and potentially get killed and be terrible for morale. So they tended to be on the home front. Some of them dotted around the country, occasionally abroad, just getting the players fit. They would make appearances for like representative Army, RAF teams, and also there were these wartime internationals. So the likes of Mercer, Lawton were playing for England, but these weren't official international games. When they could, the players would get back to Goodison, so you would get players, where their commitments allowed, they would still be playing for Everton in these wartime competitions. But increasingly, as the war went on, it was sort of make do amend. So you'd have players guesting left, right, and centre, not so much for Everton, but also for a lot of Everton players guested for other clubs, especially in the London area if they were based down at Aldershot. So it just meant there was no continuity. The crowds weren't great. It was the football was done really to help boost morale for the people back home, help the war effort in that way. But it wasn't, the training, it was all hurried. You'd be doing your job all the week and then just rushing there to play, getting to Goodison at 2:30 to play. So it wasn't that continuity, not that level, not that standard. So that when we did try and pick up where we'd left off in 1946, that was impossible.
So when football kind of restarted in 1945-46, it was too late in the season for a Football League competition to be organised. So instead, there was this novel idea of an FA Cup where every round was played over 2 legs. So what did that Everton team look like that came back for that 45-46 season? Was it basically the core of the 38-39 team, or were there already some significant changes?
For some players, time had taken its toll. Jock Thompson had retired. Billy Cook was edging towards retirement and went to play in Wales. Then some key stars had left, though. Jimmy Caskey, who was a lovely little winger who'd come down late season and really helped in the run-in. He, along with Torry Gillick, went to Glasgow Rangers in 1945 because they played a lot of football back home in the wartime. Tommy Lawton, sadly, had domestic issues and decided to have a fresh start, move away from Merseyside, and we sold him to Chelsea for a big fee. But you're losing the best striker of probably of that particular generation. So when we did kick off, it was Harry Catterick, better known as an Everton manager. But he was sort of thrown in as Everton's number 9 in that first FA Cup tie. Other players like Joe Mercer were playing with injury by 1946 and was deemed to be finished by the club and effectively drummed out and allowed to leave for Arsenal. Of course, Joe had the last laugh with an illustrious career at Highbury, winning FA Cup and League honours and just extending his career into the mid-50s. And then you had still the core of the team there, your Benthams, your Alex Stevensons, your Wally Boys, Norman Greenhalghs. We haven't really talked about Norman, but he was known as Rollicker. Great character, really tough fullback. Stanley Matthews hated playing against Norman.
And of course, he had a connection with your great grandfather.
Norman was from Bolton, but went to New Brighton to try and boost his career. And the manager there was, again, my great granddad, Bill Sawyer, who then sold him on to Everton for a decent fee. So a lot of the familiar faces, but most of them in their 30s. These are guys who were entering their dotage as players. And of course, again, haven't had that sort of level of training and competition for the previous 6 or 7 years. So we're having to bring in some other players from the youth ranks, people like Jackie Grant. But we were just over the hill. And other teams, like Liverpool, managed to, kick on and, win the league. We ended up with a mid-table finish. And unfortunately, it was downhill till we got relegated in 1951. And so really, from the start of the war, it was 2 decades before Everton really got back on track at the dawn of the John Moores era.
I mean, it's really frustrating is to think how good that team could have been, how they prevented them from continuing to go on with the silverware for Everton. And you kind of mentioned there, how the players had changed since they came back after World War II. Some had moved on. Theo Kelly was still there. And there are some people who kind of blame him for not keeping that team together, that he could have handled the departures, Joe Mercer, maybe Tommy Lawton a bit better, and T.T. Jones as well.
Yeah, I think we have to credit Kelly with what he did to keep the club running during the war. This was there was no real income coming in from wartime football. It was make, do, amend. Theo and other guys were doing air raid watches to make sure that no incendiary bombs were falling on Goodison and setting it alight. Goodison did suffer bomb damage from a bomb nearby, but which damaged the Bullens and the Gladys. But I think they played a day or two later, and there was no mention of it in the newspapers. So Kelly had done a great job of just keeping the club ticking along, but I think that had taken its toll. Theo liked a cigarette. He liked to drink as well. So the Theo Kelly of probably 1946 was not the Theo Kelly of 1938. Yes, he handled the departure of Mercer badly. Could he have talked Tommy Lawton round to staying? I don't know. He was reportedly very high-handed with Lawton. Who knows? And I think by then the whole model of there was also boardroom issues going on. There were disputes between sort of Will Cuff on one side and some other directors in the background around the way the club was sort of run and managed. So the club was really becoming in a state of flux. Everybody had seen better days, really, both on the pitch and in the boardroom, probably.
So, moving on, are there any particular stories about players, what they did after the Everton days were playing? Where I like the thing about Graham Souness pulling into a petrol station, and there's Alex Stevenson dispensing the petrol to.
Alex Stevenson, Stevie, to his teammates, is one of my favourites, researching this book. A brilliant character, a brilliant little player in the Alex James mould, that little inside forward.
Smallest member, latest arrival and inside left, Alexander Stevenson. Before he played football, Alex was suspected of ducking underneath turnstiles instead of going through them. Now he ducks underneath opposing defences.
Stevie had quite an eventful life. He was at Everton to the late 40s. Then he was player manager at Bootle, running a sort of news agent and sweet shop in Kirkdale. He then his marriage broke up. He moved to Ireland. He was manager of the Ireland team for a while and at St Patrick's. But then he came back to run a pub just across the way from Dixie Dean's pub in Chester. So the two of them were having this rivalry, who could have the most caps and medals on display above the bar. But that didn't work out. Stevie, great character, but not a great businessman. Then he ends up sort of working on a building site in Bootle, and latterly working for basically the local corporation on looking after the streets. It's hard to imagine now.
It is.
And then in retirement or semi-retirement, he's working at this petrol station, and the story goes that he was on pump duty there in the days where you sort of have a guy on the pumps, and Graham Souness just signed to Liverpool, and there's Alex ends up having a chat with Liverpool's new midfield signing. So great sort of coming full circle there. Some other interesting stories. Billy Cook is sort of very it's quite a scary character as a fullback and sometimes as a person, but also Billy, in the Guardian they had this sort of secret footballer column for many years and people guessing who it was. Well, Cook did this for the Topical Times in the 30s. He wrote a weekly column, fairly anonymous. It didn't take a rocket scientist to work out who he was, but he was something of a man of letters. But his coaching career after Everton, he went all over the place. He coached in England, Ireland, Scandinavia, what's now Iraq, and then most interestingly, he went to Peru as the national team manager in the 50s for the Copa America. Didn't end well. Billy sort of refused to use an interpreter, expecting the players to understand his sort of Glaswegian Irish accent. But just amazing where he found himself. And but in later life, he ended up living in Bootle, going coaching lads in the park, going around local pubs, showing people his medals if they're buying a drink. So some guys had a great life afterwards. Other guys fell on hard times. Tommy Lawton, another one. Stayed in football for a while, but then had failed business ventures and had difficulties. But Joe Mercer came in and did organised a testimonial for Goodison in 1972. So, apart from maybe Mercer and Tommy Jones, who ran a pub in Pumplelly, but later became a very successful manager of Bangor. A lot of the other guys sort of faded into relative obscurity, and it was interesting and bittersweet to sort of delve into some of those stories.
So, what did you most enjoy about writing this book? Because obviously there were certain difficulties. You had no video footage to go on, so basically you had to plough through all these press reports and things. So, what did you most enjoy about writing this book?
It was great to find the few people who actually saw that team.
Yeah.
There's a few guys in their 90s.
Wow.
Yeah,
Honestly.
there's a lovely guy in Ray Terrier guy in Blundell Sands.
Yeah.
Another guy though in Wales in his 90s who actually saw that team.
Wow.
And my dad, and I regret not getting him to commit more memories to paper, but for my dad, that was the team.
Yeah.
So it was great to get the few first-hand memories, but just to delve into those match reports and just they brought it to life so well, understanding the characters, understanding the quality of that side. So it was a privilege, really, and a lot of help from families. I managed to contact just about all the families of the players and officials involved, and to get those sort of personal inputs to bring it to life. So it was great for me to just learn more about the team that my dad said was the best.
Yeah. And I suppose when you were contacting those families, I mean, for some of them, it might have been the first time in a long period that people got in touch about the kind of the grandfathers and fathers who played for Everton in the 1930s.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, obviously, people like Joe Mercer's family who are great. They've had inquiries in the past, but like Archie Barder, tracking down his daughter, and his Archie's wife was still alive when I started researching this book. Bless her, she passed away since. But it's a surprise for people, but a pleasant surprise. Once you assure them of your intentions, and they know you're not a sort of crank, and it was great that they added photos, memories, all that stuff, just to give that colour to the stories.
And final question from me, Rob. So, in terms of great Everton teams, where does the 38-39 team stand? And in your view, is this another example of an Everton team who never quite got the credit or recognition they deserved?
Well, we've been there before. Obviously, 1914-15, we won the title, very much overshadowed because war was already underway in that case. And, there really was a lot of resentment that players were doing that well when they should have been on the front. The 38-39 team denied, I would say, a great team, but denied probably greatness in the wider public consciousness beyond Merseyside. But we all have our own greatest teams. For me, I saw the 80s team. You saw that team, but also saw the team in the late 60s. So we'll all have our greatest teams. But from what I've read, it only reinforces my dad's view that that team with Lawton, with Mercer, with Sagar, with Jones was the greatest and could have got even better.
Rob, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to your stories about that team for 38-39. I have to confess, it's a team I know very little about. It's been absolute education for me as well. And I just highly recommend this book. I mean, Rob's research is absolutely meticulous. It's a brilliant read. Gives you an insight into football, but also some life into the 30s. It's one of my favourite. Rob's written some great books. This is definitely up there with my favourite Rob Sawyer books. And you get the chance, make sure you get a copy, because once you start reading it, you won't put it down. And once again, Rob, thank you so much for bringing this to the attention of Evertonians everywhere. But what a fantastic team this was. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.